Welcome to episode 2 of Education, a Clusterfuck in Need of Repair. Episode 2 is entitled Reclaiming the Language of Teaching and Learning, or Stop Talking Shit About My Best Friend. Before we start, I'd like to emphasize that all ideas presented in this podcast are my own and do not reflect the thoughts, opinions, or positions of my employer, Emerson College, its programs, or its representatives. We're forgetting what we know about best practices in teaching and learning. What's happening now feels wrong, but what else is there? Since the first episode of Education, a Clusterfuck, dropped, I've been asked frequently why I'm doing this, what I want to accomplish. And I'm going to use the start of each episode to answer questions people had about the previous episode. So if you don't care about why I'm doing this, just skip forward, no hard feelings. But I've done some thinking about it, so too bad for you, I'm going to tell you. This story sounds like a detour, but it pertains, I swear. I was listening to NPR on my way to work, and the guest was a reporter and writer who spent a lot of time in China across his 30-plus year career. He was in China again recently and was talking to a young Chinese woman. He mentioned Tiananmen Square, an event he'd witnessed during one of his visits, and she looked at him blankly. "I don't know what you mean." "The protests in Tiananmen Square." Her face was blank. The image of a young man facing down a tank, so familiar to many of us, was unknown to her and others of her generation in China. It was eliminated from any mention in schools, and talking about it was seen as sedition against the state. So for many citizens of China, it simply did not exist, as though it never happened. As the older generation dies, it truly will be forgotten, completely and forever. That's what I see happening in education. We're forgetting what we know about best practices in teaching and learning. Those of us trained in the time before No Child Left Behind testing are aging out of the teaching population, or abandoning it in disgust or despair. We still teach constructivist theory in colleges of education, but its implementation in schools is unrecognizable in form and intent. Even students who remember a time before the nightmare of testing, are forgetting there ever was another way. What's happening now feels wrong, but what else is there? Plenty. There's plenty of what else. And I don't want teachers to be the only ones who know that. We need everyone to know that if we're going to return learning to its rightful, elevated place in human experience. Language shapes thought. Think about that. Language shapes thought. That's a theory in linguistics. At its most basic, it means that we can't think about something we don't have words for. But in a broader way, the words we use and the way we use them impacts how we understand the world. And in education, over the past 25 years, how we talk about what's going on has in part created the reality of what's happened by eliminating many of the process words of learning. Words like making meaning, developing, generating, belonging. Constructivist tenets that describe what we still understand to be best practice. These process words are being replaced by endpoint words, what are called observable terminal behaviors. Ironic. Something you can see happen, like correctly completing an equation, reading a passage and answering questions correctly, doing an experiment in science without blowing up the classroom. That seems reasonable, right? Much more scientific than assessing a child's meaning making, and much easier to quantify, to compile into data points that must be reported to everyone. Eliminating the individual, both the individual student and the individual teacher, from the assessment. And voila, we have standardized tests. the ultimate disembodied, top-down, quantitative control mechanism for schools. No question of quality. There's a right answer and 3 wrong answers. Did they get it right or wrong? Simple, right? The problem is they don't work well for most learners or most teachers. The need to get kids to pass these standardized tests has fundamentally changed the curriculum in most public schools. It's narrowed topics. Is this on the test? No. Then skip it. It has eliminated a lot of hands-on project-based learning, what we know works best for most learners, but too hard to quantify. No data points to report there. But the biggest problem is they don't reflect the way the mind works or the way young minds develop. This approach to education has changed the goal of learning from developing the child's mind, facilitating their ability to think creatively and critically, helping them understand curriculum, not just acquire facts and observable terminal skills, and replaced it with the acquisition of decontextualized facts. Questions with a right or wrong answer that can be identified with a virtual number 2 pencil on a computerized sheet of numbered bubbles. And one of the ways this was accomplished was through the careful shifting of the conversation about education, by changing the language we use to discuss what's happening, why it's happening, and especially who's to blame for what's happening. A slight detour. I used to have a pin that said, I didn't say it was your fault. I said I was going to blame you. I know, too good. And a guiding principle in schools right now, especially from the media. If COVID has impacted learning in all kids, delaying learning for at least an 18-month period, how is it now the fault of teachers that this delay isn't instantly remediated? Ask the media that reports on it. In this episode of Education, a Clusterfuck in Need of Repair, I'm going to talk about the use and control of words and how we ended up at this point. But more importantly, what we can do about it. Oh, another slight detour and a trigger warning. I have a pin that says, speak the truth even if your voice shakes, because that's part of the solution in my mind. I also have a magnet on my fridge that says everything's funnier with the word fuck in it. That has nothing to do with this podcast, really. I just love that magnet. Now, you're probably imagining my house covered with metal circles with pithy, irreverent sayings. While not completely inaccurate, it's an exaggeration. A lot of them are rectangles. There's unlikely to be a national shift back to effective teaching and learning until we introduce a way of talking about it that's more grounded in education and influenced by education-knowledgeable people, and less by people with other motives. There are 4 ways to consider the why of the narrative around education. Possibility number 1. It's written about by people who don't know anything. Now, I don't actually think that's the problem. Consider the story from about a year ago about a man diving for lobster off Gloucester, Massachusetts, who was swallowed by a humpback whale. Not really swallowed, because humpback whales are designed to eat things that are much smaller than a full-grown man, but the whale closed his mouth around the guy, realized it wasn't a huge krill in there, and spit him out. The reporter who wrote about this was a stringer for a relatively small local paper. Probably not a marine biologist specializing in the anatomy and behavior of humpback whales. So how did the reporter find out these facts about whale behavior? Oh wait, they asked someone. They talked to a marine biologist who was an expert in whale physiology and behavior. Yay, yay! Especially in this era of the magic box, my none too affectionate nickname for my phone, you can find out a lot very quickly. So I don't think it's ignorance, because language shapes thought. Those who report on education, the mammoth humpback of all time, the Moby Dick of research topics, can access too much information, but only what's accessible. And a lot of what's easily found and quickly digestible is generated by mainstream media in the language of data points and standardized testing. So I think it's much more intentional and venally motivated. For example, possibility number 2. I think it's about money. The cash money that funds education. Federal funds, state funds, and local funds. Federal discretionary funding alone for 2023 was over $79 billion. In Massachusetts, add another $6.6 billion in state funds, and then the local monies from towns and cities. That's a lot of dough. And because the U.S. guarantees the right to a free public education to every child, that's a stable source of income too. It will be available every year, regular as clockwork. Oh, mama. A brief detour. You know the Looney Tunes cartoon with the hungry wolf looking at Porky Pig and seeing him as a delicious ham surrounded by all the fixins? Yeah, that. In the 90s, corporations experimented with taking over challenged public schools in Boston, Massachusetts, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, etc. Their premise was that running the schools more like a business would eliminate costly waste reflected in urban settings where teachers were struggling to educate children who were experiencing a wide range of societal challenges. Poverty, homelessness, involvement with what is now called Child Protective Services, the Department of Youth Services, or a bunch of other names. Involvement with the criminal justice system, and on and on. It didn't go well. The testing outcomes for these corporate trials were lower than the scores in the publicly run schools in the district. Part of the issue, of course, is the whole living kids thing. In layman's terms, if you're growing bushes in a landscaping business and one of them develops aphids, you just pull it out by the roots and dispose of it. But you can't do that with kids. Theoretically, at least. I'll be talking about charter schools in a future episode. But we were treated to a lot of business language in the meantime. Streamlining, accountability for teachers, accountability for parents, accountability for kids as they struggled to squeeze a profit out of public schools. Again, I didn't say it was your fault. I said I was going to blame you. There have been many other attempts to make a profit from public schooling since corporations took their ball and went home, but all of them are variations on a theme. Michael Apple, in his book Education and Power, talks about the socialization of costs and the privatization of profits. Schools, funded by the taxpayers, become profit-bearing opportunities for private companies. This is true for school vouchers and charter schools currently, with taxpayer dollars given to private companies who run programs for profit and leech money from increasingly impoverished public schools. Yet in the news, in spite of often epic financial malfeasance and low test scores in charter schools, the narrative is not about whether charter schools are a good idea, but about how many more of them we should have. Language shapes thought. Oh, a small detour. I have a rectangular refrigerator magnet that says, as my mother always said, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Yeah, that. Okay, back on the road. Testing is all about money. Money from taxes paid to private corporations to create, vet, administer, grade, and report the results on an increasing number of standardized tests. In 2019, by age 18, American kids attending public schools had taken 115 standardized tests. Students in the UK, which is a test-based system, had taken only 15 to 20 standardized tests by age 16, and Australian students took only 4 standardized tests across 7 years of schooling, and none of those in elementary school. In reading popular articles about education, the question of whether we should be using standardized tests, how much they cost, the socialization of costs, and the privatization of profits is rarely discussed. We need to reintroduce information about what we know about how people learn into the national conversation about public schooling. I've been thinking about how people would react if they knew some simple and horrifying facts that never seem to make it into mainstream media. Here are a couple I like to mention in polite company. Massachusetts just signed a 5-year contract for MCAS testing, their state No Child Left Behind test, for $179.6 million. That's $35.9 million a year of taxpayers' money. New Hampshire, no state income tax. New Hampshire projects spending $2.6 million a year. A particular favorite of mine, since No Child Left Behind was overturned in 2015, 9 years ago, there is no requirement to do any standardized testing in public schools. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, states are required to conduct only 3 tests across the entire 12 years of schooling. They can be developed by the states and do not need to be standardized tests. But many states are still spending millions on standardized tests. And as my mother always said, what the fuck is wrong with you? Even public school teachers are often surprised by that one. And you might not be surprised to hear that even people with no kids are upset by those dollar amounts. Imagine if everyone knew that under ESSA there were no required standardized tests. What kind of ripple effect could that have in any education system? For example, if those millions of dollars were no longer allocated to testing, what could be done in classrooms to facilitate learning and to engage students more fully? Could you have an SEL teacher for a school, a social emotional learning teacher for a school, instead of laying that responsibility on the theater teacher, or if you're not lucky enough to have one of those, on the teaching artist that's charged with adding social emotional learning to the theater projects they're paid to teach? Could you have an additional resource person for math or reading, which we are so incredibly concerned about post-COVID? If you're from Massachusetts and can think of something that your school needs that would cost about $100,000 a year, send it to me at educationclusterfuck@gmail.com. Clusterfuck in this case is spelled CLUSTERFCK for purposes of decency. And I'll share some of those next time. If you're from New Hampshire, think of something that your school needs that would cost about $30,000 a year. If you're not from Massachusetts or New Hampshire, look up what your state has allocated. It's public record. Divide it by the number of school systems in the state and send your ideas to me at educationclusterfuck@gmail.com, and I'll share some of them next time. So, possibility number 3. I think it's about the market, filling needed jobs. Now, to be fair, every society educates for a market economy. We project what jobs will need to be filled in the next 20 years or so, and then we tailor education to prepare young people to fill those jobs. And as markets evolve, the skills required by workers also evolves. In the 20s, we used to teach simple literacy and numeracy and the willingness to obey instructions to prepare people for a life of factory work, for example. Now we need people to be computer literate at pretty high levels. Oh, Chromebooks and iPads in schools. That's so nice, right? No. It's about the market and what we need kids to be able to do after graduation. One of the repeating messages on education in the press is about the effect of social isolation during COVID on kids' school performance now. In my more bitter moment, well, let's face it, are there any others? Really? Okay, occasionally. I think we wouldn't be addressing the need for SEL in schools, except that kids will one day need to be adults who need to be able to work with other adults. At the political level, schools are driven by a concern for capitalist markets, not by concern for kids themselves. The problem is teachers are concerned for kids and how to teach them effectively. So they're in a classic middle management squeeze play. Pressured to get good testing outcomes by schools that are judged in the media for student test scores on state tests, on the SAT, ACT, AP tests, college acceptance rates, etc. And on the other side, to meet the needs of young people they see 5 days a week and feel responsible for. So they do the test prep teaching and in many cases do what they know is best for the kids on the sly if they have the time. What choice do they have? On the one hand, sorry, principal, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. And on the other, sorry, kids, if you can't learn this way, you'll just have to drop out or flunk out. Or there's always vocational education. A few more fun facts to share with others. A third of teachers nationwide left teaching last year. Not changed jobs, abandoned their profession. Where is that fun fact in the media coverage? I have yet to see an article discussing that which doesn't blame it on the poor behavior, lack of work ethic, and diminished social skills of the kids, and implying that a good teacher, a committed teacher, would have been able to rise above and make up for 18 months of lost teaching time while facilitating the COVID trauma of the students. What the fuck? Since 2011, one of the most important traits for employees identified by businesses is creativity and the ability to think outside the box. In 2008, the creativity of American children was at a 20-year low. It has not improved. A third fun fact, the brain is designed to learn best, develop best, collaboratively, not individually. So kids hunched over their iPads and Chromebooks, while good for their future employers, are not doing their best thinking and learning. Okay, a detour on the detour. There's a ballot question this year to eliminate passing the state test in Massachusetts, the MCAS, as a requirement for high school graduation. I heard the argument recently that Massachusetts is number one in education. Why risk changing anything? That's a classic market argument. Our status impacts how kids' college applications are viewed by Ivy League schools. Who would fuck with that? It also affects real estate prices, our attractiveness to new businesses, and a bunch of other cash-type market stuff. Not that attending an Ivy League school doesn't result in real cash outcomes for the graduate. It does, for the handful of students who can get into an Ivy League school. But just for your information, of the 10 states that still require passing a standardized test for graduation, one, Massachusetts, is first in the nation. One is 49th in the nation, and everything between. To my final point, possibility number 4. It's about power. The power to control how people think about the world in order to maintain the status quo. I've said it before, 2 weeks ago to be precise, that as teachers we have tremendous power to shape the thinking lives of our students. We see them for 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, for 180 days a year, for 12 to 14 years, depending on your system. Oh, and for those who fear a cult-like teacher leading kids off a cliff, try to remember that there are many, many teachers seen in that time. Teachers who are people with different perspectives, strengths, and weaknesses, but all with a similar goal: to teach kids. And constructivism, based in 20 years of education research, with its emphasis on learning styles and the meanings made by the students, is still what we understand as the gold standard in how to do that. Constructivism offers some basic tenets that hugely impact teaching and learning. The importance of teaching ideas in real-world contexts, so kids know how those ideas are connected to their lives and to other areas of thought, so they can build new ideas on their held understandings. That's called scaffolding in constructivist terms. The importance of hands-on tasks that engage many different types of learners. Typing on a Chromebook doesn't count, nor does drawing on an iPad. The importance of belonging in the classroom and the teacher serving as a coach or facilitator for learning. Detour to a little-known fact. When teachers create a sense of community in their classes, when students, feeling that community, experience a sense of belonging there, it isn't just nice. I mean, it is nice, but that's not why it's important to do it. A sense of belonging is a necessary but not sufficient condition for learning because it quiets the amygdala, the part of your brain that's triggered by a perceived threat. That threat can be physical, that kid's going to hit me. Emotional, I'm going to be wrong and everyone will laugh. Or intellectual, I'm not sure of this answer. I'm not raising my hand. In reaction to that threat, your amygdala suggests 3 possible courses of action: fight, flight, or freeze. Like the way an animal freezes instead of getting out of the way when you drive up in your car, leaving you with occasional flashbacks and lifelong guilt. Oh, that raccoon. I swear I think about it every time I drive on that stretch of road. The larger problem in humans is that if that perceived threat is big enough, your brain can experience what's called an amygdala hijack, in which almost all of your higher brain functions are linked to that amygdala response. On a PET scan, your whole brain lights up. It's beautiful in a way, but it robs you of the ability to access higher order thinking, sometimes any thinking if the risk is bad enough, for 15 to 20 minutes. 15 to 20 minutes. Think about that kid who couldn't answer a question, and no matter how many times you asked, how you changed the wording or simplified it, that kid just stared at you like that rabbit caught in the headlights on the road at night. Chances are that child is experiencing an amygdala hijack. Okay, back to constructivism. Most important is recognizing that students are makers of meaning, not empty vessels to be stuffed with knowledge that will then be regurgitated on a test. We know what works best to crank out kids with the ability to work with others, to constructively problem solve, to understand complex ideas, and draw connections between areas of thought. Why aren't we doing that? In all of the media coverage of what's wrong with education today, why aren't they advocating for that? They could find that in a few minutes of magic box searching. But mainstream media is part of the capitalist system that runs things. Most media outlets, and that includes text, radio, and television in all its streaming glory, are owned by wealthy individuals or corporations or monopolies, and the message is sadly consistent. Schools are failing, teachers are failing, kids are failing, and it's clear where the blame should be placed. We didn't say it was your fault. We said we were going to blame you. And no search for solutions, just more of the same. Push teachers harder, push kids harder, and ignore the obvious negative outcomes of doing that. It will work eventually, right? Right? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different outcome. Now, I'm not the only person who knows this stuff. So why isn't it changing? Because controlling the way people think, by controlling their understanding of the world, by restricting their life options, virtually guarantees that the status quo will remain the status quo. The poor will stay poor, the rich will get richer, and nothing will change. So we, teachers, students, parents, humans, need to talk about it a lot. A few fun facts to shock and outrage your friends. 1. People who can afford to send their kids to private schools prepare them to fill jobs in the socially and economically upper echelons of our markets. And students who attend private schools and religious schools don't need to take and pass state tests, even in states in which a standardized instrument is a requirement for high school graduation. Gosh, how did that happen? 2. In 2015, when teachers and students at Garfield High School in Washington State refused to participate in state standardized tests during No Child Left Behind, all the teachers weren't fired. All of the kids weren't denied college admission. Those were the threats. They just stopped taking the tests. And nothing happened. And many parents supported them. 3. In 1968, when students in East LA trampled a chain link fence and left school, demanding the schools they deserved before they'd return, the Los Angeles School Committee made the changes they'd previously refused to make. We have a huge history of effective collective action in this country. Through collective action, we've given ourselves the weekend. We forced safer working conditions and a living wage in a lot of different industries, and created one of the most powerful unions in this country, the teachers' union. And the fear and hatred of that union is part of the effort to disempower us by standardizing instruction, by identifying us as the problem in the press, by demeaning our profession, those who can do, those who can't teach, fuck you, and demanding that we fix the mess that is education right now, a clusterfuck, if you will, without additional resources, support, or increased salaries. There are millions of teachers, students, parents, and just interested parties in America. If we talk about this, it's the beginning of change. As my refrigerator magnet says, fall down 7 times, stand up 8. That's a Japanese proverb. Okay, I have a friend, a woman who used to be a teacher and now works in HR in a mid-sized company. She has 2 little kids, a 3-year-old and a newborn, and she and her husband are already struggling to figure out what to do about their education. Now, as a licensed teacher, she knows what education is now and what it's supposed to be. She told me in a defeated voice that she didn't believe things could ever be different. Well, I believe they can be different. We've changed the face of education many times across 400 years. For God's sake, in colonial times, we taught boys, who could afford to pay for school, basic literacy and numeracy almost exclusively through the study of the Bible. Today, we teach millions of children for free in schools that cover a wealth of subject areas. We were able to move away from God as the central guiding idea behind how to teach. What could we do now that would be more controversial than that? We evolved past pushing kids out of school and into factory work in 8th grade as not cut out for book learning. We evolved past using corporal punishment as a central behavior strategy in most states. We evolved past blatant segregation in schools to the segregation on the down low we have now. That's a topic for another time. We evolved past looking at teaching as basically unskilled labor, and so on and so on. If we could move from one-room schoolhouses to huge systems of education, from basic literacy and numeracy to the extensive curricula we teach now, we can change again. We made this up. We can fix this, especially since we don't have to invent the wheel as we did in the past. We can just reattach the wheel of constructivist teaching and learning that we left at the side of the road because someone convinced us that it was a flat. Finland didn't find it flat. In Finland, that tire has been rolling along for 35 years. It's not that people aren't listening. It's that we're not speaking about what we know. Not loudly enough, not publicly enough, not frequently enough. Maybe that's why politicians and systems keep loading teachers with more responsibility and ever more requirements for documentation, data points, record keeping, to shut us up by keeping us too busy, too overworked, too tired, and too disgusted to speak. There are 3,842,796 teachers employed in the United States today, and 75.2 million students, more or less. How much noise could we make if we came together, if we spoke the fuck up? So next time someone talks about the success or failure of education as a series of test scores, tell them you assess students through a constructivist lens. Explain a little. Can kids think creatively and problem solve? Can they answer an open-ended question that doesn't have a clear right or wrong answer? Challenge them to consider the whole child. Pummel them with the facts at your disposal. I recognize that this is easier at a family dinner than it is with your department head or principal. Amygdala hijack, right? And hey, I'm afraid when I tell someone something they don't want to hear. I get that feeling like my heart is climbing into my throat. I think of the stakes in this game. I think of the kids we're collectively responsible for, and I do it anyway. So speak truth to power, even if your voice shakes. Once again, if you're from Massachusetts and can think of something that your school needs that would cost about $100,000 a year, or from New Hampshire about $30,000 a year, or from another state and you did the math, that amount, send it to me at educationclusterfuck, all one word, educationclusterfuck @gmail.com. And I'll share some of them the next time. Episode number 3 of this podcast will be released in 2 weeks on Friday, November 8th. The plan is for episode 3 to be an interview with a high school teacher in the greater Boston area who will be sharing her strategies for combining social emotional learning goals and subject matter. Moving forward, we'll try to include some potential solutions for improving the clusterfuck in every episode. This podcast is now available on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon. We're a growth industry. So thank you for listening and for your support. I've really been overwhelmed. Please add a review or response to this episode if you have time, and I'll talk at you again on November 8th with an expert in the field. P.S. I want to apologize for any background noise that we were unable to filter out. I actually don't live in a sound studio, just a house. We're doing the best we can.
J like the letter, I'm making several waves. I know the mission the same. I made a splash, now all of my passes last like running a race with Usain. I keep it coming like this is a buffet. And if I'm stumbling, I'm in the grave. Never gon' fumble it, I get the bag and I run with it, gunning it, gunning it, gunning it, gunning it.